Fox News Podcasts presents the Bret Baier Podcast with Fox News chief political anchor Bret Baier.
Just days before President Trump and Vladimir Putin's planned meeting in Alaska, Russian forces advanced roughly 6 miles into eastern Ukrainian territory, one of the most dramatic advances, actually, by the Russian army in recent months. The area is Donetsk. The Russian offensive closely follows President Trump's statement that peace negotiations between the two nations may involve territory swapping, a concession which Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky staunchly opposed and may still oppose. As of August 12th, 2025, Russian forces occupy approximately a fifth of Ukrainian territory.
Because there'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody. To the good, for the good of Ukraine. Good stuff, not bad stuff. Also, some bad stuff for both. So there's good and there's bad. But it's very complex because you have lines that are very uneven. And there'll be some swapping, there'll be some changes in land. And the word that they will use is, they make changes. We're going to change the lines, the battle lines. Russia's occupied a big portion of Ukraine.
Meanwhile, back on Capitol Hill, the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department is now under the control of Attorney General Pam Bondi and her team at the Department of Justice in what the Trump administration has said would help curb growing violence in the nation's capital. To discuss this and more, we bring in our panel, former Deputy Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, Karl Rove, Democratic strategist, former Biden-Harris campaign surrogate Kevin Walling, and Fox News senior Congressional correspondent Chad Pergram. Karl, I want to start with you on this Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska. I'm heading there on Air Force One, and we'll do the show out in Alaska. You know, you, with the Bush administration, had, some interaction with Vladimir Putin. It seems like the Trump administration, President Trump, is optimistic, but maybe realistic heading into what is now being described as a feel-it-out session.
Well, we dealt with a different Vladimir Putin. He was tentative, unsure of himself, trying to figure out the role for Russia in the modern world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But after 2004 and 2005, with the so-called color revolutions, those are the democratic uprisings in parts of the former Soviet bloc, he became a different person, I think. He became committed to the restoration of not just simply the Soviet Empire, but the Russian Empire, and began to have, since then has taken Crimea, threatened the Baltics, tried to subvert Georgia, tied some of the stands closer to their to Russia, and exerted their economic, military, and geopolitical influence on behalf of a very different approach than he had in the early part of this century.
Chad, there's skepticism on Capitol Hill that on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, about meeting with Putin without having anything tangible going in. There is also a sense that Putin may be feeling the economic crunch, the additional tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. Perhaps that's going to happen to China as well. Eventually, Russia's economy will feel the pinch, and maybe that's where this is headed.
Well, don't forget that that's kind of what happened in the 1980s, early 1990s with the end of the Soviet Union. It was pretty clear after the, Reagan, summit at Reykjavik with Mikhail Gorbachev that, the Soviet economy could just not keep up in terms of what the United States was doing, certainly not keep up in terms of, missiles and everything else. And so that's what started to elicit some of the change in the then Soviet Union. I mean, if history is to be our guide, maybe what is past is prologue. That said, we've heard this before. They've been slapping sanctions on Russia back to the Obama years, different things, human rights abuses and everything else. As somebody here on Capitol Hill said to me at one point, they said, how much more possibly could there be to sanction? So we'll have to see. And that might actually, make a difference. The real difference, though, and where we'll be able to get a metric, and this is an unfortunate metric, is just maybe how things go this winter. We're getting close to, things starting to change. The weather this fall, it does get cold in those parts of Ukraine, a little bit colder than it does in most parts of the United States. And also, that that hurts the Soviet troops as well. There's kind of a fighting season a little bit there. The one thing, though, I want to flag that's a unique dynamic, and we've seen some success with this from the Ukrainians, and I talked to August Pfluger, who's a Republican representative from Texas, about this pretty extensively, is what has been learned in terms of drone warfare. There have been a number of drone attacks, remarkably successful, very innovative by both sides, particularly the Ukrainians. And is that something they can continue to sustain? And it's not that expensive. It requires a lot with intelligence and everything else. But that's something that could be a game changer. But again, probably the best thing from a political standpoint in Washington is that this summit in Anchorage is happening, with Congress being out of session. Both the House and Senate are out, and there's not going to be a lot of commentary emanating from Capitol Hill about this in the near term.
But the bipartisan bill that Lindsey Graham and others were putting forward to put the pinch on Putin is shelved right now by the administration?
Yeah, there was hope that they might be able to take that up before the recess. And people like Graham and Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut, people who were very much game to do this and had interest in doing this, they just couldn't get that done before the August recess. Again, we've seen sometimes some striking situations where suddenly somebody says, okay, let's do it. But I think, if they don't get some sort of a deal and don't get some sort of noted progress after this summit, then, come September, that's going to be next to funding the government and maybe a debate about the Epstein files. That's probably going to be number one in the Senate.
Yeah, Kevin, the president is bringing with him the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Steve Witkoff, his negotiator not only for the Middle East but has met with Putin several times. It seems like there may be some outline of a bigger, broader deal, that maybe Russia gets some kind of trade deal as well with the U.S. I'm guessing here. I don't know that for a fact, but one would think that this is there are multi-levels here.
Yeah, Brett, I think that's certainly one of the expectations going into this summit, although you're seeing the White House sort of downplay in recent hours and even days some of the expectations going into this summit that we will have some kind of overarching peace deal coming out of this. I think this is, from the White House's perspective, from what I've heard, more of a kind of feeling out situation between the president and Vladimir Putin. Obviously, their first encounter now in Trump round 2, and it also obviously harkens back to Chad's point of the Gorbachev-Reagan meetings. To Carl's point, the meetings obviously early on in Putin's tenure, whether it be at Walker's Point or at the ranch in Texas, and this president loves the optics of that. Obviously, Congress is going to be out of session. This is going to draw a lot of attention, and again, I think it's also a matter, to your point, Brett, of setting expectations going into this, right? So you have all these personalities on Air Force One flying out to Alaska. What actually comes out at the end of the day for the Ukrainians and for the Russians?
Panel, we'll hold it right there. All right, let's turn to domestic politics and specifically Washington, D.C., Karl. This effort, and it's now completed, federalizing the D.C. Metropolitan Police under Attorney General Pam Bondi's control in an effort to stop violent crime in the nation's capital. Just to analyze politically what that move means and what do you think it looks like?
Well, it means that he dominates the news coverage for, days leading into it. But remember, the authority that he has to federalize the Metropolitan Police Department is limited. I think it's, 30 days or maybe it's 45, but he's got a limited
30.
number of days. Yeah, 30 that he can exert control over. So the question is going to be, what kind of permanent change is there that can be affected in 30 days? We'll see. But it allowed him to, control the news cycle for not just the day that he made the announcement, but for several days going in and several days coming out. And for the president, I think that's really important. He wants to be in charge of the news cycle. He wants the lead in every day. He wants to be the bride at every wedding. The best man at every bachelor party. He wants to be the guy who dominates the news, and he certainly has dominated here in the last couple of days. The question will be, in the aftermath of this, is he able to point to some significant permanent changes in the quality of public security in the District of Columbia?
Right. Congress could give him a longer leash there if they pass something. But, Karl, when you have Democrats arguing publicly, well, look, the numbers have gone down in D.C., almost arguing like they did when talking about immigration and illegal immigration, how it wasn't really as bad as everybody thought. And yet people in D.C. would tell you, yeah, it has gotten worse, and the security is an issue. It's almost like they're fighting the losing battle rhetorically.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that the mayor responded to it by saying, yeah, more federal presence would make for a safer community.
Yeah.
And, look, this is a broader problem than just Washington, D.C. For example, the same day we had the likely next mayor of New York City, Mr. Zoran Mandani, saying, I'm going to be spending public monies to fight the administration on deportation of illegals. Now, okay, fine. Let's see how, if he does get elected, how long that lasts when the administration is trying to deport a violent criminal. In fact, this gave an opening, it strikes me, to a smart Democrat to say, well, you know what, I agree with Mondami. We're going to spend taxpayer dollars, but we're not going to spend it if they got a criminal record in order to begin to get some of the excesses that have hurt the Democrats so badly. Yes, we're in favor of, we should not be deporting the criminal illegals. I mean, this is, now we've got them, originally it was let's defund the police. Now it is, let's not have more law enforcement officers on the streets of Washington, D.C. Bad move.
Yeah. Chad, up on Capitol Hill, I know they're on recess, but the reaction to all of this obviously directly affects a lot of lawmakers.
And I think that's what Karl is alluding to here, is that the Democrats have an optics problem. The idea that they want to be fighting for Washington, D.C., which is a key constituency. But what President Trump is kind of doing with a little bit of a sleight of hand here is saying, well, this is how things are running in these other democratically controlled cities. We saw what he did a couple of months ago in Los Angeles. He's talked about Chicago. There's been a lot of attention in Cincinnati with some of the violence there, frankly, pretty bad stuff. So that goes back to this whole issue about, who's actually on the side of law and order. Now, again, that's an issue where Republicans historically have been able to kind of champion that in the post-George Floyd world and say, look, Black Lives Matter. It might tilt a little bit too far to the left. Suburban voters don't really get that. There were protests and violence in the streets after some of the George Floyd protests, and that's something that, worked to the Republicans' favor. Now, again, the Democrats, maybe that's not the hill that they should be dying on. It's kind of like, the whole thing with some of these illegal immigrants that were coming through, and you had Chris Van Hollen going to El Salvador, and Republicans were able to say, again, whose side are you really on? So it's a wedge issue in that sense. As to the broader issue, this is kind of, as we've heard it said, you buy it, or you break it, you buy it. And so if things don't get better in Washington, D.C., is the optic just enough? If the actual crime statistics aren't better, if there continues to be violence in Washington, D.C., again, it is better, but it's not maybe where it should be. And you have, this really affecting Capitol Hill. You had an intern for Ron Estes, who is a congressman from Kansas, who was murdered just a couple of months ago. You had an aide a couple of years ago for Rand Paul, who was, it was a brutal assault. You had Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Texas, was carjacked. There was an aide after the Congressional baseball game a couple of years ago who was assaulted. I mean, this goes on. And some of this goes back to the 80s. When D.C. was a pretty dangerous place. I mean, you had an aide to Richard Shelby, the former senator from Alabama, who was killed. Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who was later the senator from Colorado, but was on the judo team in 1964 for the United States at the Olympics, was actually attacked walking home and took care of the guys because he was a judo champion. So some of this is not that new, but again, it's an optics problem for the Democrats because, again, this is a Democratic-run city, and they can complain all day long about, home rule in D.C., but that doesn't matter a lot to the guy in Dubuque.
Yeah. And Kevin, to be fair, the numbers that they posted have come down. There's been an allegation about whether those books were cooked in the D.C. Government. But I'll tell you, I mean, that you do look over your shoulder. It's like any other city. It depends on where you are in the city. I try to get out and about and run or get on the National Mall, and it feels fairly safe. But down from my house, just outside of Georgetown, there was a carjacking. 3 guys got out of a car. They hit the back bumper of a car. The guy pulled over just to get the insurance, and 3 guys jumped out with guns and took his car. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So carjackings are up some, hundreds of percent in the District of Columbia.
They certainly are, Brett. And I think one of the scary elements of that is the fact that so many of these carjackings are being committed by 13, 14, 15-year-old kids in the city. And that's certainly an element that's out of control. I think to your point, Brett, originally, I think Democrats often get lost in statistics. We love to say, to your point earlier, that border crossings were down. We love to say that violent crime is down. Well, if you don't feel safe in your city, if you constantly are seeing border crossings streaming across different borders on television, you are not feeling that directly. And over the course of the last couple of days, you've seen so many people come forward with their own stories that you just shared of personal interactions that they've seen or witnessed or felt themselves. And Democrats have to play this well, where they acknowledge some of that. I think the mayor, for example, as you said, has actually done a very good job of navigating this situation, of saying, we welcome this assistance. She's met with the Attorney General just today to navigate this influx of troops and where they will be positioned and how they will assist. And I think she will then be a better advocate to advocate for that $1 billion, hopefully back when Congress returns, and Chad can obviously speak to that better, of that return of funds that were taken back just a few weeks ago before Congress retired for the summer session, that we have that hole in budgeting that could go for policing and response and criminal justice in the city. Mm-hmm. So hopefully this process will play out. But to Chad's point, it is a break it, buy it situation. And we'll see over these next 30 days how the process plays out.
Yeah. And quickly, Chad, we're up against another fiscal cliff here once we get back.
Yeah, they have to fund the government by September 30th. How they do that, I don't know, because Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, sold the farm, much to the dismay of the left, and he has to extract some king's ransom this time. Could be the D.C. bill, could be other things here. We just don't know yet, but they have to get 60 votes, and this is where Russ Vought, the budget director, says he wants a more partisan, his words, appropriations process. Well, that's fine, but you don't get your policy goals, and you also can't get over 60 votes in the Senate unless you have some buy-in from the Democrats.
Okay, guys, thanks so much. Now for a bit of history. August 14th, 1941, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and then U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued the Atlantic Charter, a joint declaration which defined the common aims of their respective countries. These included, among other things, the right to self-governance, the prevention of any territorial acquisition that contradicts a population's wishes, and a desire for all nations to abandon the use of force in favor of peaceful negotiations. The idea laid out in the Atlantic Charter went on to become a quintessential part of the United Nations Charter, an intergovernmental organization that now encompasses 193 member states. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Carl, Kevin, and Chad, I'm Brett Baer. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.